All right, welcome back to Dinosaurs. So we're all set with Module 1, and today we're going to start into Module 2, which is ultimately vaguely about dinosaur evolution and dinosaur behavior and morphology and how we know. We're not going to talk immediately about dinosaurs, though. Again, we have to set the stage a little bit before we can talk. So today we're going to talk about life before the dinosaurs. So what the Paleozoic world looked like before the dinosaurs came on the stage in the Mesozoic. There is no class on Wednesday, so on Friday, we're going to discuss the Mesozoic world aside from dinosaurs. So what was the environment like that the dinosaurs were in, and what were they living with? Then we're going to start getting into some stuff about dinosaur evolution, and we're going to talk about pterosaurs, and we're going to talk about marine reptiles. We're going to talk about some of those things that are not actually dinosaurs that a lot of people probably came in thinking we're dinosaurs and we're probably excited about talking about. So let's touch on them a little bit so everybody's not disappointed. Then we're really going to get into details of dinosaur evolution and how we know anything about how dinosaurs were built and how they behaved. And then in the next modules, we're going to get into very specific dinosaur clades. We're going to dig into detail of each individual clade and talk about specific fossils and things like that. And then we're going to talk about some environments, and then we're done. So hopefully everybody kind of gets the idea of where we're headed here. So some announcements. If you're really struggling, there's always time to stop by office hours. If my office hours don't work for you, reach out to me and we can schedule an appointment. And then, of course, the discussion board is a great place to get help too. Probably not live on demand, but somebody will answer your question. Maybe me, maybe not, maybe one of your peers. Okay, so let's start all the way back in the beginning again. So we've seen this before. Originally, the Earth was this molten ball floating in space, and it formed about 4.5, 4.6 billion years ago from the accretion of smaller fragments. Again, like building a snowman. You take a handful of snow, smash it together, get a bigger snowball. In this case, it's take a small little rock floating through space, crash it into another small rock floating through space, make a bigger rock, bigger rock, bigger rock, bigger rock, bigger rock, bigger rock, gravity pulling all this together, accreting these smaller fragments into a bigger fragment, which eventually becomes Earth. Earth clears its orbit of all these rocks, assembles them together into what we know as Earth, a very, very different place than what we see now, particularly right now. It's very cold and windy outside. That's not what this was, very, very much the opposite. So the early Earth was scorching hot, fire and brimstone, Hades, the Greek version of hell. Again, the atmosphere was toxic, ammonia, methane, very common, no oxygen, or very, very little oxygen. You would instantly suffocate, and no surface water at all. This is the Hadean Earth. Relatively quickly in Earth's history, though, Earth cooled down. Again, we talked about this already. It condensed, it rained for probably millions of years. The water filled in the low spots to make these first oceans. Where did the water come from? Well, a lot of it came from outgassing from volcanoes. Some of it came from icy comets crashing into Earth. Exactly what that ratio is still under debate, but some came from both sources. And then we ended up with the oceans. We had a blue marble finally. We've progressed past the Hadean into an oceanic world that has no life. Life has not yet developed on this planet, but we've got oceans, we're setting the stage. So how did life come to be? Again, we mentioned this a little bit earlier, but so this has always been a question that puzzled people, is how did something come from nothing? How do you start with a totally inorganic world, just rocks and elements and minerals and chemicals? How do you get organic compounds, organic life? How do you get some living, reproducing beings? So in like the Middle Ages and before that, life was thought to just kind of generate spontaneously, kind of out of nowhere. So like flies would magically appear on rotted meat. You leave meat out, it is going to rot and there's going to be maggots. Where did the maggots come from? The meat turned into maggots. Rotting meat turns into maggots. Or grain that sits around turns into mice. That's where mice come from, is they come from grain, because everywhere you have grain sitting, you have mice and rats. Fish just kind of spontaneously appear out of the mud. It kind of makes sense because like if you leave broth out, it spoils even though like nothing appears to have touched it. This was before we learned about like germ theory and things like that. Although like during the plague, they talked about like the black miasma. We were kind of trending in that direction, but still it's not something obvious. We can't actually see this stuff happening, so it's very hard to understand. But Louis Pasteur kind of had this experiment where he sterilized the container, he sealed it, and noted that the meat didn't rot. The flies were drawn to the smell, but they were prevented from going in, and the meat didn't spontaneously turn into maggots. It just kind of sat there and dried, and nothing was able to touch it. So we started kind of getting down this path of the spontaneous generation thing doesn't work. So where does life come from? We saw this slide a little earlier before, but let's talk through it again. Under current Earth conditions, life only develops from other existing life, but that's not a good answer to where life came from originally. Right now, life comes from life, so it originated from other life. That's a big loop. We've got to close that. So the big problem with replicating the origins of life is that right now, any of the available building blocks that are around are very quickly consumed by the life that's already here. But remember that early Earth, the Hadean, and then into the Archean, once we cool and have oceans, we have these oceans with liquid water, and we have a lot of these building blocks kind of floating around. We have these chemicals, and this is kind of floating around in this primordial soup. But they're not being used by living creatures because there are no living creatures. There's no living organisms to consume these building blocks, and so they're allowed to build up. And eventually they start forming together and building a structure and replicating themselves and becoming what we know of as life. So how does that actually happen? Well, think about how the first cell would form. So the first cell would be how you're able to kind of start assembling and organizing and kind of creating a little capsule environment that's different from everywhere on the outside. You're able to start bringing stuff in and storing it and accumulating it and protecting it. And that's sort of heading towards life. It's not actually living yet, but how do we build these complex things? First, there was some sort of, well, the proposal is there was some sort of scaffolding going on that would assemble these complex things together. So like my favorite theory is that minerals at Earth's surface, minerals have a crystalline structure, minerals have charged surfaces, especially clays, and that life, the building blocks of life assembled themselves on those inorganic templates. And so this was a way to take the chaos of these floating, free-floating organic molecules and start sort of assembling them into something that sort of resembled a structure. And then once you've done that, you have to start accumulating and bringing them together. But how do you isolate and protect them? Well, the leading idea that's relatively recent is that if you drop a bunch of oil in water, it forms these little itty bitty capsules, these little balls of oil or lipids, fat. And this happens naturally. It's a process that just occurs naturally because of the different charge structures of these lipids. They form these sheets that wrap around into a sphere. And so the idea here is that these lipid spheres would act as sort of a proto cell membrane and allow things to be kind of concentrated inside and moved outside and kind of create a little environment where things can start sort of accumulating. Now, most life on Earth, except for some weird stuff like viruses, very primitive viruses, are DNA based, but initially it was probably RNA, a little bit simpler, and it progressed over time. So this is the idea, and again, nobody was there to witness it. This sort of evidence is not preserved in the rock record, and so this is, I don't want to say speculation, but we can't actually test this. So we haven't been able to reproduce it in the lab yet. And so there may be an entirely different explanation, but I tend to favor this one, but we may never know. What we do know is that eventually life did originate and there was life. How it happened precisely, we don't exactly know, but the Stanley Miller experiment that we talked about, that lightning in the bottle, sort of reproduces some of the basic building blocks. If you start structuring those on a scaffold like clay minerals, and then you start protecting them inside a lipid membrane, you start heading in the right direction, but there's still a lot of stuff that we don't know. But we do know that by 3.5 billion years, so when the Earth was about 1 billion years old, there was already life. And the first life, the first definitive signs of life that we've seen are in the form of cyanobacteria. They used to be called blue-green algae, but they're not actually algae, they're bacteria. So they're called cyanobacteria, blue-green bacteria. Their morphology, their shape, their size, the way they behave, they still exist on Earth today, and they basically do the same thing they've been doing for 3.5 billion years. This is an ancient stromatolite deposit, which is basically mats of these cyanobacteria, and these are modern examples in Shark Bay, Australia. It's the same thing. They've been doing it for 3.5 billion years, uninterrupted. They've been doing their photosynthetic thing, taking in sunlight, taking in carbon dioxide, expelling oxygen, and oxygenating our atmosphere. There is some chemical evidence that suggests that these things were around, or something was around photosynthesizing even earlier, but we don't have actual fossil evidence of it. But these are some of the earliest examples of fossils in the rock record, and it's about 1 billion years before we have anything. So these are very simple prokaryotic cells. How do we get more complex? Well, the idea here to get complex to a eukaryotic cell, to start going down the path of like complex metazoans, animals, and then eventually to mammals and reptiles and things we know today. How do we get beyond a very simple cell? Well, the idea was that we start with two kind of independent bacteria, and one kind of engulfs the other. It sort of Pac-Mans it up. And then that one bacterium that was consumed, instead of being digested and consumed for the resources, it actually just starts living inside of it. And both bacteria start to benefit from this arrangement, and over time they sort of pass it on. So again, this idea here is that you have a prokaryotic host cell, and it ingests something, some different organism, and that organism eventually becomes the nucleus of the new cell, or the mitochondria of the new cell. And then for photosynthesis, there's a photosynthesizing bacterium. That cell engulfs that bacterium, and that photosynthesizing bacterium actually becomes the organelle that we know of now as the chloroplast. And so these cells are sort of Pac-Manning up these other living cells and sort of incorporating them into their structure. And over time, the cell gets more and more complicated. Again, we can't reproduce this in the lab. It's just an interesting way of approaching things. Eventually, we might get there, but some evidence that points to this being the thing, though, is that chloroplasts and mitochondria have their own DNA. Mitochondrial DNA is separate from the cell DNA. So it's almost like these little organelles in the cell are their own separate things. Perhaps they were separate all along. There were different organisms that were encapsulated. Another thing that's interesting is that these organelles, for example, in our body, these organelles react to antibiotics that target bacteria. So like, why would a chloroplast in a plant react to antibiotics that target bacteria? It's a plant, not a bacteria. It kind of leads to that maybe these organelles originated as bacteria. And the other thing is that cells can't actually replace them. Cells can't grow new ones. If you kill it, it goes away. They reproduce, but the cells can't regenerate new ones. They split. So another kind of evidence that sort of points in that direction. So for a long time on Earth, this was what was happening. You see this going from single cell to multi-cell happens about 2.7, 2.5 billion years, something like that. This is 2 billion years of Earth history before we get to a eukaryotic cell, a cell with a nucleus and organized organelles. This is like half of geologic time before we even get this far. The next big step is actual megascopic fossils. So not just cells, not just unicellular organisms, but multicellular organisms, something that we might refer to as an animal or a plant, multicellular organism. So the first evidence of these appears shortly after the end of Snowball Earth. So I think we mentioned Snowball Earth before, but it's this idea that the entire Earth, or very nearly the entire Earth, froze over with a colossal glaciation. Evidence for this is that there's a lot of rock missing from the Earth, a lot of erosion around this time. And these fossils here were found as these impressions in this rock in the Ediacaran Hills of Australia in 1946. They were eventually recognized as the earliest multicellular organism, so about 600 million years. Again, Earth's history is like 4.6 billion years. This is the last 600 million of that. It's 4 billion years of Earth history before we even get to multicellular fossils. And these are nothing like animals that we would think of today. They're soft-bodied, they don't have any hard parts. They're very similar to like sea pens, sea jellies, some worms, and some are just so weird that we don't even really know what they are. So keep this in mind. This is one thing I'd like you to take away from this lecture. I don't necessarily care if you remember all the names and all the stuff, but remember the scale of geologic time. Again, we've seen this 24-hour clock before. We start Earth at midnight, and then for like the first couple hours, we're in the Hadean. It's that hell-like Earth. 12 hours later, we're only into the Proterozoic, where we start seeing just like single-celled complex organisms, or single-celled eukaryotic cells. It's not until all the way to here, at around like 8:30, 9 o'clock at night, that we get multicellular organisms, something that we might start calling an animal. Our friends the dinosaurs don't appear here until about 11 p.m. And then early humans appear in like the last minute before midnight, and all of recorded human civilization is like a snap of the fingers, the last couple seconds, less than a second before midnight. So keep in mind this scale. For the purpose of this class, we're going to be talking mostly about the Mesozoic. We're going to be talking about basically just this like hour from like 11 o'clock to 11:45, something like that. All the rest of the stuff we're going to talk about is in here, okay? And we've all gone all the way to here already, which is a couple slides. So there's not a lot of stuff living on Earth for this whole portion here. So keep that in mind. So one of the big landmarks in evolutionary history, in the history of life on Earth, is the first vertebrate. So aside from insects, most of the things that we think of when we think of animals, especially on the land, are vertebrates. We have the bony vertebral column. So where did vertebrates come from? There's a deposit in China called the, and I'm going to butcher this name, I apologize if anybody can put the right pronunciation and discover in the discussion board, I'd appreciate it, but Chengjiang Fauna is the first vertebrate appeared. So it's an early, it's already diverse. They still don't have a lot of hard parts, so there's very few of these animals that have any kind of skeleton. But this particular organism here, Miloconingia, it has a notochord, a very primitive, it's not even really a vertebral column, but it's the early stages of a spinal cord. This is probably the earliest vertebrate ancestor. And so again, this is millions of years ago. This is about 500 million years ago. So remember, Earth 4.6 billion years old. The earliest thing that even approaches a vertebrate isn't until about 500 million years ago. Relatively recently in geologic time, a bunch of other kind of crazy looking things, mostly arthropods. There's also some sponges, some brachiopods. We'll talk about those a little bit. But this is probably the big takeaway here, is the possible vertebrate ancestor. And so everything with a backbone, all mammals, all reptiles, all amphibians, all fish, all derive from this ancestor back here. This is our great, 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 great million greats grandparents. So the next thing that happens, so the Chengjiang fauna, now we're up to Burgess Shale. We're starting to get in the middle of the Cambrian. You don't need to remember these geologic names. If you do, that's great, but don't worry too much. Just know this is about 500 million years ago. We're into the Paleozoic. The Burgess Shale fauna was discovered in Canada, and it was discovered in 1909, before we saw a lot of this other stuff. So for a long time, we kind of had nothing. And then all of a sudden, the Burgess Shale fauna is like the first early signs of life. And life is already pretty advanced, already pretty complex, already pretty diverse. We see a lot of the modern phyla represented. So there's already arthropods. There's already a lot of the modern phyla that we recognize. One of the cooler critters around here is this Anomalocaris, which means strange shrimp. So this is probably the first apex predator on the planet. There's some debate as to whether its mouth parts are actually capable of eating hard-shelled organisms like these trilobites, but it was certainly crunching on a lot of these things. This was the first like terror animal where like other organisms would like run in fear of this. It was kind of just able to eat almost everything. Anomalocaris, the first apex predator. And then shortly after the Burgess Shale, there's this thing called the Cambrian explosion. So the Cambrian explosion is just this rapid evolutionary radiation where at this point, all of the major invertebrate phyla are kind of locked in. Everything except bryozoans is already present after the Cambrian explosion. And then from then on, we're just modifying the phyla. We're not adding new ones. So like all the basic schematic plans for different organisms is already locked in kind of by this point, very soon after the first animals. So why the timing here? Again, Snowball Earth was ending, the ice was melting, the lands were eroding, nutrients were being input into the sea. Those cyanobacteria, the blue-green algae, had been pumping out oxygen into the environment for billions of years by now. And so free oxygen was present. Oxygen was breaking down into ozone in the environment to make the ozone layer to protect us from UV radiation, not us, but protect organisms from UV radiation. And then just the appearance of something like Anomalocaris, where it was this massive apex predator, just started feasting on things. The prey needed to evolve to keep up. So then we started hardening into shells and eventually skeletons to avoid being easily predated. And so as the prey became harder and more armored, the predators responded. And so evolution kind of kicked up into high gear with this predator-prey relationship where they're trying to outdo each other. And at this point, the stromatolites, the cyanobacteria, kind of go into decline. So there's a little bit of a debate as to why. One is, did they almost kind of poison themselves with the oxygen in the atmosphere? Now they created an oxygen-rich atmosphere, which is not what they evolved in. They evolved in the oxygen-free atmosphere. It's not really conditions that they like very much, yet they're the ones that created it. So unfortunately, there's sort of a parallel to what we're doing now, but another alternative is that there was a new grazers that were just feeding on them, and they weren't able to protect themselves in any way. All these new animal forms were able to feed on them. So after the Cambrian explosion, so like Cambrian explosions here, we go from very few genre up to a pretty decent peak. There's a little extinction event, and then we ride up this peak to a lot of biodiversity. So this is number of genre, and this would be like planet-wide. For the first time in the history of the planet, we have a very diverse flora and fauna. There's a lot of different types of animals with a lot of different types of body plans. This is the great Ordovician biodiversification. So it's this massive radiation that global diversity triples in about 20 million years. So life is experimenting with a bunch of new body plans, trying to figure out what works, what doesn't. There's a lot of filtering out of body plans that are less successful, and a lot of further advancements in body plans that are proving very successful. And so the genre just rapidly increases. And then there's actually a spike here downwards. That's a mass extinction event, probably related to climate change or disruption in the carbon cycle. And then we rebound, another big extinction event in the late Devonian, and then there's a rebound. And we see this pattern kind of through time where biodiversity increases, times are good. Then something happens, usually a disruption in natural cycles like the carbon cycle, either too much carbon leading to a greenhouse environment, or too little carbon leading to a snowball environment. And there's the major drop-off, an extinction event, and then that leaves a lot of room for other organisms to fill. The old organisms are extinct, the niches, the roles that they were filling are now open, and organisms that were lucky enough to make it through start radiating out and filling those niches. And so we kind of see this pattern repeated through time. Diversification, extinction. Diversification, extinction. Diversification, a pretty good long run here at the end of the Paleozoic. Extinction, the greatest extinction ever. Diversification, tiny extinction. And then this massive diversification here that represents the age of the dinosaurs. Dinosaurs, or very early dinosaurs, start appearing here in the Triassic. It's really this kind of extinction here that really bumps off dinosaur, the arms race, and diversification of dinosaurs. And we kind of ride that up until the dinosaurs go extinct at the end Cretaceous. So keep this kind of pattern in mind. Diversification, extinction, you fall off the cliff. Room opens up, by diversification, another cliff, and we see this replay through time. But during this diversification, we start getting all these organisms that we recognize as Paleozoic organisms. So if you go to the rocks around here in New York State, almost all the rocks in New York State, except we talked a little bit about dinosaur footprints down near like Connecticut and Jersey in the Newark Graben. There are Coelophysis footprints down there. Those are the very few Mesozoic rocks in New York State. Most of the rest are Paleozoic, or if you go to the Adirondacks, they're Precambrian, Proterozoic. But if you go to the rocks around here, a lot of the fossils you'll find are these things, Paleozoic fauna. So what do they look like? Again, if you go fossil hunting around here, the Tug Hill Plateau has excellent fossil hunting. The Allegheny Plateau to the south has excellent fossil hunting. The Oswego sandstone around here is relatively unfossiliferous, mostly almost entirely unfossiliferous, but you can find a lot of these creatures around here. So there's brachiopods. They kind of look like clams. They're different from clams, but they superficially resemble clams. There's these things called sea lilies, which aren't actually flowers, but they kind of look like these. They filter feed with their arms. When they die, they kind of break up in these little Cheerios or sometimes or SpaghettiOs, depending on your flavor. These are very common in rocks around the Tug Hill Plateau. There's these massive straight-celled cephalopods. So they're kind of like Nautilus, but their shell is straight. You see here's a diver for scale. So Orthoceras got massive. A lot of these things got very huge. And you find a lot of their shells, just evidence of these straight shells. These are pretty abundant too. Rugosporin corals, kind of about the size of your thumb or so. A lot of bryozoan material, kind of this very delicate mesh. And then probably the most famous, my personal favorite anyway, are the trilobites. So this is a trilobite fossil. Ooh. So a lot of trilobite material in New York. This one happens to be pyritized, made out of fool's gold, so that's pretty cool. So these are the Paleozoic fauna. Again, I don't expect you to remember the names. I don't necessarily even want you to remember the names, but if you happen to be out fossil hunting around here, these are the things you're going to see. So all of these things live in the water. So we're talking so far, we haven't mentioned anything on land. Why? Because nothing was on land. So all the way up to this point in geologic time, all the way to about the Ordovician, the land is barren. There's nothing on the land. There's no life on the land. There's no trees. There's no flowers. Eventually there's insects. So in the late Ordovician, the oldest known terrestrial animal is this millipede. So this is the first evidence that life is actually on the land. Again, we always think of like the land and sea, life thriving in the sea, life thriving in the land. It wasn't until the Ordovician that there was anything at all on the land except barren rock. So at this point there's another evolutionary explosion. Again, going onto the land surface is this, like, it opens up all these new niches, all these new areas that organisms can thrive in. It started out with very basic plants. So this is Cooksonia, one of the earliest photosynthetic terrestrial plants. Eventually, they evolved into vascular plants, and then finally the animals. But again, if you look at ancient rocks, there's no evidence for plants, no evidence for animals, not even insects, until about the Ordovician, when you start seeing spores. We don't even really have any fossils until the Silurian. This is only known from footprints. But once you've opened up that room and once you've put your foot through the door, there's all this new space. And so there's this boom in complexity, this boom in diversification, organisms adapting to these new environments. One of the coolest stories, at least for us in New York, is that in New York State is evidence of the earliest known fossil forest, the first true forest. So there was a big flood in Gilboa. I think it's Gilboa. It might be Gilboa if anybody's from there. Again, please let me know. There was a big flood. It kind of washed out a dam, and they started finding these big fossil stumps. So large trunks. It was called Eospermatopteris is what the trunks were called. Just the trunks mostly. Later on, much later on in 2007, we started finding material with branches and leaves that were actually preserved. They'd previously been called Watizia, and basically we've figured out that they're the same, that these trunks match up with those leaves and those branches. So again, a pretty dramatic example of how incomplete the fossil record is. They named the stumps and the roots something different, and then the crown and the leaves something else somewhere else. And only recently did we figure out that, oh, these actually fit together. They're the same tree. They actually had different names. They thought the top was a different species from the trunk because they weren't found together until very recently. Gilboa had the title for the oldest forest for quite a while, and then an even older forest was very recently discovered near Cairo, New York. There's a museum in Gilboa, and you can go see some of this material here, so it's pretty cool. One thing to also keep in mind is that when the first forests appeared, that was the first time that we probably had forest fires. Until this point, there wasn't enough organic carbon, enough material, enough carbon on the surface to oxidize into a fire. And so we often think about like fire as one of the primal elements of nature. Fire is a relatively recent phenomenon. There was nothing to burn until these first forests appeared. So that's pretty cool. And the earliest evidence of true forests is in New York, which is also pretty neat. So at the time that these forests are appearing on land, in the seas, there's a lot going on. So that arms race between predator and prey continues. We start seeing that fish start kind of dominating. A lot of kind of bonier fish, a lot of armored plates, the armored placoderm fish. The extreme version of this is Dunkleosteus. Again, like we talked about Anomalocaris as like a scary apex predator. This guy is a much scarier. So this is a life-size replica here. Most of the body's not preserved because it was soft tissue and probably cartilage, but the bony head plates are preserved, and especially the bony jaw. And this is not something that you would want to encounter. Again, like, why did we develop these big chunky jaws? Well, a lot of the organisms had developed shells, and they're like, haha, you can't eat me, I'm in a shell. And then fine, well, now I have these huge crushing jaws. And then of course, now instead of armor, prey could start advancing towards speed and maneuverability, because you're not going to build enough armor to resist these jaws. So again, it's like this arms race, survival of the fittest, again, sort of problematic, but the adaptations that help the prey avoid being eaten before they can reproduce, those will be maintained in the population. The ones that don't will be filtered out. And so over time, the prey get fitter, and then the predators get fitter in response. And so as we get these apex predators developing, that really drives evolution in the prey species. And then of course the predators have to evolve as well to keep up. And so this is when evolution really sort of starts kicking off into high gear. And not to be outdone, so we talked about plants colonizing the land, and we talked about some insects, that millipede colonizing the land. Well, there's all that open room, all that open territory. The oceans, the seas are filled with the fish. The fish are dominating. Dunkleosteus is chasing you in the water. On land, there's all this open space, all these plants, all this food, all these niches that are unfilled on land. And so lobe-finned fish that have these special lobe fins that are somewhat resembling hands, started crawling out onto the water using their paired pentadactyl 5-fingered fins. They would crawl out briefly and probably slink back. Why would they do that? Again, they're probably exploiting food resources right along the water's edge. Everything in the water is being fought for hard by a lot of other species. If you're able to wiggle your way out onto the shore, you can find a different way to survive, a different resource that nothing else is going after. And then it's all for you, and that's great. It's good to have a nice free resource. Spiders, centipedes, snails were probably already on land, so that's another food source for these things. And so kind of like over time, we see this evolution from these lobe-finned fish. They start exploring up on the beach every once in a while. They're still fish. They still need to go back to the water to breathe. They only have gills. The next step in the process is Tiktaalik, is this famous fossil. Has this sort of compressed, elongated snout head. It was probably the first vertebrate that did significant amount of time on land. Again, the insects were already there. But Tiktaalik very likely had both lungs and gills. And it had not only, so again, the 5-digit fin, and then Tiktaalik had this fin with a wrist that would let it move around a little bit easier on the land. And it also had lungs so that it didn't need to go back to the water as much. And it probably spent significant amount of times out of the water. Sometimes it's called a fishapod, fish foot, sort of transitional between true fish and the tetrapods that came later, tetrapod 4 feet, the 4-footed vertebrates with their 5-finger pentadactyl. Why 5 fingers? Because this early Tiktaalik had 4 limbs that had 5 quote-unquote fingers. And we've inherited all the land animals, besides the insects that were already there, inherited that general structure. And then the next kind of logical step is that Ichthyostega was probably the first true amphibian, where instead of really being kind of like a fishopod, that was kind of like mostly a fish, come up on land every once in a while, stay for a little while, and then just kind of go back. Ichthyostega probably always just kind of hung out at the water's edge, equally at home in the water and the land, the first true amphibian, so no longer a transitional form, but truly an amphibian. And then the next step is, so now we're through the Devonian, and again, don't try too hard with these geologic terms. If you're stuck up on them, it's fine. But the next geologic period is the Carboniferous coal swamps. So we're into the Carboniferous. At the time of the Carboniferous, it's very hot. The ice caps are not present. There's sea levels really high. Coastal areas of the continents is drowned by the high sea levels. And so there's a lot of really like shallow water areas all along all the coastlines. It's swampy, excellent place for swamp-like vegetation. All these very famous Carboniferous plants, Glossopteris, Lepidodendron, Calamites, all the kind of fossil tree bark that we find. It's one of the eras of the Carboniferous is called the Pennsylvanian. If you go down to the southern part, extreme southern parts of New York, mostly into Pennsylvania, You can freely find fragments of these ancient trees, and it actually forms a lot of the coal deposits that we use. That's why it's called the Carboniferous, because the Carboniferous was a time of a lot of organic material accumulating and not decaying because there was so much of it that the oxygen couldn't decay it fast enough, and it was preserved as fossil fuels, as coal. Again, we'll talk about that later. The fossil fuels, dinosaurs did not become fossil fuels. A very insanely small fraction of fossil fuels are from dinosaurs. It's mostly from photosynthetic small plankton, and a lot of the coal are these land plants. So at this point in the Carboniferous, we've got amphibians, we've got a bunch of different creatures living along the water's edge. But one of the characteristics of amphibians is they have to lay their eggs in water. So the amphibians are still tied to the water's edge. But the development of the amniotic egg sort of rules that, or sort of changes the game a little bit. So as animals continue to adapt to this new terrestrial environment of living on the land, amphibians are exploiting the coastal area close to the water because that's what they're adapted for. If you can figure out a way to get further inland and stay further inland, that's a whole new area that nothing has exploited yet. And so how do you do that if you have to lay your eggs in water? Well, amniotes evolved probably something like this. They're called basal reptiles. It's kind of a bad word for them because they eventually branch off to reptiles and mammals. But these very primitive amniotes, the first egg layers, an egg is a way of kind of taking seawater with you. If you lay a hard-shelled egg, that's a way to bring seawater up onto land. It's a self-contained little tiny ocean, and it frees you to kind of move inland. Eventually, we put the egg inside the body, for us placental mammals, but reptiles still lay their hard eggs on land because of the advance of this amniotic egg. So the egg was kind of the key to unlocking all the way deep into the continental interiors, and now life could start really exploiting everywhere. And as animals adapted and evolved and started exploiting plant resources, plants had to respond in kind. And so there was this big revolution in plant evolution. And again, another arms race between plants and animals that are exploiting them, another kickstart for evolution. And then we get to the Permian, the last part of the Paleozoic. Again, dinosaurs are Mesozoic. We're talking about Paleozoic today. The Permian's dominated by this, it's kind of the age of these big bugs and the rise of the quote unquote reptiles. Again, reptiles isn't the best name for them because they branch off later to both the reptiles and the mammals. There's a lot of reef building. So like if you go down to Texas, the Guadalupe Mountains are just these massive reef complexes of Permian age. Forestation of the land continues. There's really high oxygen levels in the atmosphere, so you can get these massive bugs. Meganeura, this gigantic dragonfly, obviously that's a replica, but you can just see how big it was. And Arthropleura, this just massive millipede, 6 to 10 feet long, just crazy. Modern oxygen levels could not support arthropods of this size, so only the high oxygen levels of this time allowed that. The climate's really, really hot, probably the hottest it's ever been. And it's also really dry because all of the continents have now assembled together into Pangaea. And so in the center of that continent, you're really far away from the ocean, which is all the way around the outsides. And so the interior of Pangaea is a desert. And this is the environment that the dinosaurs will inherit. Why do they inherit it? I guess I should also point out that Dimetrodon here was during the Permian. So Dimetrodon, a thing that is very often called a dinosaur, is absolutely 100% not a dinosaur. In fact, we'll talk about it, but they're on the evolutionary line that leads to the mammals. So the end of the Paleozoic, again, if we think back to the geologic timescale, these major increments in the geologic timescale are defined by major upheavals in life. So for example, the end Permian here, diversify, kind of stasis. and then we drop off a cliff. This is the largest mass extinction ever in the history of our planet. 90 to 96% of all species go extinct on land and the sea. That Paleozoic fauna that I talked about earlier, crinoids make it through, but trilobites don't. All these big placoderm fishes don't make it through. Almost everything that was large of some relatively big size goes extinct. And there's this transition from the Paleozoic fauna to the Mesozoic fauna. And we start seeing things that we would kind of more recognize today, but still there's the end of the Paleozoic fauna replaced by the Mesozoic fauna. The Mesozoic fauna is replaced at the end of the Cretaceous, and then we get into kind of more modern fauna. But this event kills off the Paleozoic fauna. So what happened? Well, at this time, there's major disruptions in the carbon cycle. There's high levels of CO2, massive global warming, again, probably the hottest it's ever been. That causes anoxia in the global oceans. So like when oceans heat up, they can hold less oxygen. It's why if you set water out on a table and let it heat up, you start seeing bubbles forming alongside of the glass. The oxygen can't be dissolved in the water anymore as it warms up. As we warm the oceans, they can hold less oxygen. And then there's also this massive volcanism. One kind of warning sign, one red flag for today is a lot of these conditions that were present at the Great Dying are starting to become present now. We have global warming, we have increasingly large areas of anoxia in the oceans. We're starting to see a reduction in biodiversity. We're starting to see hints that maybe we're entering into another mass extinction. Fortunately, we don't have the massive volcanism, or in the case of the end Cretaceous, the asteroid impact to really kind of push us over the edge, but we're heading in the wrong direction. How massive was this volcanism? These are the Siberian traps. This is Russia. So this is Kamchatka here, there's Japan, Europe's over here. This is the extent of the Siberian traps. In case you're not familiar with Russia, Russia's incredibly large. This covers most of the area of Siberia. And what you can see here are these layered basalt flows, just these massive kilometers thick flows of basalt from these unprecedentedly large volcanic eruptions. And so this is what led to the Great Dying, the largest mass extinction of all time. People will kind of debate the relative contributions of each of these factors. Was it more the global warming or was it more the volcanism? We're still kind of arguing about that, but clearly none of it helped. It's kind of like the more factors align against you, the more likely the mass extinction is very large. So to have the largest mass extinction of all time, we needed a lot going against us. And so bear in mind that although we always talk about the end Cretaceous mass extinction, the one that killed the dinosaurs, that's the most famous. This is by far the largest one, quite a bit larger than the one that killed the dinosaurs, which we'll talk about later on in the class. So this is just a kind of summary of where we're at. And again, from like midnight all the way to afternoon, it's just single-celled life. We don't get to like complex multicellular, what we might start calling animals until about 9 p.m. The sun's already set. We're well into the evening before animals get on the stage. And then of course, we're going to be talking about dinosaurs. Dinosaurs don't really happen until about 11 o'clock, the last hour of the day. And then again, humans is that flash. And so this is kind of the journey here, the Proterozoic, the Cambrian explosion, the age of fishes, the great biodiversity event, early land plants here in the Silurian, age of, this is Dunkleosteus, the fishes. Moving down through here, we don't really get amphibians until like Mississippian, animals start colonizing the land. The mammal-like reptiles, again, not a very good name. They're neither mammals nor reptiles, so kind of, we'll talk about that. And then at the end of the Paleozoic, Pangaea is assembled, and this is where we're going to pick up. The Great Dying at the end of the Permian opens up space. It opens up niches. It opens up roles for these new Mesozoic organisms that eventually lead to the dinosaurs. And that's where we're headed next. So that's why we talked about this. And that's all I got for today. So goodbye until next time.